Associate Professor of Social Sciences. I want to thank Professor Hao Huang here, who is the faculty organizer in charge of the Great Minds Seminar, and Professor Jeff Terry, who is here as well, and great supporter of the seminar. Our guest today is a crosstown colleague from the University of Illinois in Chicago. Professor Josh Drucker is associate professor at the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at UIC, where he has taught since 2008. Professor Drucker's research focuses on regional economic development. He is seeking to understand the phenomena of growth, decline, and adjustment to design policies to achieve positive economic outcomes. His current research looks at the features and impact of property taxes and business incentives in Cook County, where we are right now. He's investigating the economic development strategy of innovation districts, which I believe is the focus of his talk today, and estimating the economic impact of NASA with the Natalie Voorhees Center for Neighborhood and Community Improvement. Professor Drucker is also affiliated with the UIC Government Finance Research Center and teaches classes in economic development policy, economic and policy analysis, and planning methods. Originally from the Detroit area, Professor Drucker joined UIC in 2008 and has been a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners since 2002. I should also mention that I am a very big fan of Professor Drucker's work. I mentioned this the first time we met in person last year in a digital science conference, that I actually use his work for my own research. And I'm really looking forward to his presentation today, where he's going to talk about research parks and innovation districts, establish and contemporary innovation strategies for economic development. With that, maybe you can take it from here, Josh.
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks both to you and to Professor Huang for inviting me for this presentation. So like he introduced, this is going to be some of my thoughts on two strategies common in economic development in the United States. The first one, research parks, has been in use for a very long time, and the other one, innovation districts, has been more popular really since not this previous recession, but since the Great Recession in the United States. And these two strategies are of particular interest to me. One of my doctoral advisors spent a lot of his research career investigating research parks in the 1980s and 1990s. That was before I was a student of his, but I learned from studying his research, and so that was one of the topics I would look at for research design. And then I also ended up engaging with research park strategies when I was a consultant. I worked as an economic development consultant in the 2000s, and research parks were part of what we were working on. Innovation districts are a much newer approach, and they're different in fundamental ways that I'll describe from research parks, but there is a strong connection and lineage between the two in economic development. I've been looking at innovation districts for 6 or 7 years or so, and so this draws on some of my own and my co-authors, co-researchers' research in that area. So since this seminar series is about important problems, I suppose I should say what societal issues these policies are aiming at. They're both attempts to improve local economies and to generate desirable economic development outcomes. Things like new firms and production growth and job creation. But more than that, both research parks and innovation districts focus on how it is that invention occurs, the process that leads from new ideas to commercially successful economic activity. And these are both ways in which regions or localities try to capture and retain the economic benefits that are produced by innovation, right? Otherwise, the benefits might fade away, decline over time, or relocate to other more advantageous regions. So I'll talk a bit about both of these topics and link them together, and then hopefully we'll have time for some discussion and questions at the end. So I'll start with research parks. These are, let's see, can I switch slide? Yep. These are really real estate ventures. Research parks sell or lease land or buildings to private sector businesses. And they do so in locations where there are advantages for those private sector businesses, from being near research, right, producers of basic or applied knowledge, or being near other research-dependent businesses. Because of that dependence on research, right, that's in the name, many research parks are affiliated with universities, especially research-intensive universities. Those are anchor institutions that can provide externalities from knowledge spillovers that will help private businesses in there to succeed. And most research parks that aren't affiliated with universities are affiliated with some other kind of major research producer, a government laboratory or an R&D facility, a research and development facility for a large corporation. The second part of the name, research park, the park part, is not rhetorical, it's also descriptive. Research parks are pretty much always in park-like settings. And there's a picture of University of Iowa's research park there. So what are the rationales for research parks as a strategy? The underlying justification, the main justification, is to take advantage of the research activity that goes on and put it to use in economic development, to translate it into commercial businesses. Research activity in the United States is enormous. It's huge in quantity. This graph shows there's something like edging toward $700 billion of research per year. This only goes up to before the pandemic. There's been some, changes after that, but it's still, the trend is continuing. And a large chunk of this research, everything that's not in blue on this graph, is funded by public or nonprofit entities that do not have economic development or commercialization as their primary goal, right? So that's about $200 billion and more per year. And that's an area that's ripe for another organization, another entity to try to translate that into commercial success. So how do research parks do that? How are research parks a tool for turning research into economic development? One of the main ways is that they help businesses to capture knowledge spillovers. These are positive externalities from agglomeration, from businesses locating near each other and locating near conductors of research. They also help to develop and reinforce clusters that are organized around particular topics or expertise. So things like pools of labor, people who work in the research areas, supply and product chains. If there's a lot of businesses in a cluster locally, they may be able to influence local public policy, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ways that theorists have discussed different kinds of cluster advantages. And then finally, research parks also provide support for entrepreneurs. The setting itself is supportive. You're part of a community with other entrepreneurs and other startup businesses. There may be assistance in technology transfer, in accessing and making use of the technology and knowledge that's being produced in the research setting in the university or the other affiliated research institution. There's also often active programmatic support from the research park itself, from the organization that runs the research park. So here's a figure that sort of tabulates some of these types of assistance that we find in research parks across the country. The most common is helping access other programs. So helping new businesses access what resources are already out there, but also and finding capital sources of funding. Those are the top two listed here. There's also lots of general business assistance provided in research park settings, with business planning and marketing and sales, with technology and understanding or assessing markets for technology, and also just general human resource issues. Sometimes research parks support businesses with some of the elements we might otherwise find in incubators, which is a related type of strategy to help small businesses thrive. And so we see things like subsidization for space, so that the rent is a little less expensive, especially for small businesses. There can be something that's not listed here, shared equipment or services, so that small businesses don't have to pay for the entire costs up front. There can also be research-oriented support. For instance, it looks like a little over a third of research parks in this figure have funding to support a proof of concept stage in development of a technology. So a lot of supports of that sort are offered through research parks. Given these rationales and the settings, it's not surprising that many research parks are also governed by universities or in association with universities. If you look at the top two lines here, about 50% of research parks are either governed directly by a university or by an organization set up to be affiliated with a university. The other half of research parks, they can be a public agency or a quasi-public corporation. They can be independent. Sometimes they're even for profit. Sometimes a developer will construct them. Where did all this come about? It's sort of backwards to go to history now, but I think it's part of my lead into innovation districts to understand where research parks came from and where they are heading, and then how that translates to the newer strategy of innovation districts. So there were probably a bunch of smaller, earlier efforts that weren't really called research parks, but the main start to major research parks we can trace to the 1950s. Major universities. Stanford Research Park was established in 1951. The Research Triangle Park, which is a joint venture between 3 research universities in North Carolina, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Duke University, and North Carolina State University. The Research Triangle Park was started later that same decade, 1959. They were not successes, at least not immediately. They were slow to get off the ground, and not much was happening for a while. Stanford's research park did not actually start doing much on its campus until the computing boom really got going. We're talking the late 1960s or even a little bit later. And Research Triangle Park in North Carolina had to lure the R&D, the research and development establishments of some major companies, IBM and Motorola, through incentives. And that was also in the 1960s, before anything really happened there, late 1960s into the 1970s. Once these two early major successes, these two major research parks started showing some success, many other universities and regional economic development agencies tried to follow suit. And that started in the 1970s, continued in the 1980s and 1990s. A lot of these research park efforts were focused on the real estate. How do you make use of underutilized land near to a university? A lot of research universities have space nearby that they own or have land holdings. So how could they make use of that in a productive sense? Many of these research parks also became integrated with local economic development strategies, focusing on endogenous development, making growth by starting businesses and developing entrepreneurship that was already residing in the community, and leveraging local assets. That's in contrast to recruiting businesses from other locations through incentives. So research parks were particularly part of these local strategies if they were thinking about promoting innovation, technology transfer, and business incubation, all strategies to start sort of technology-based or research-oriented businesses in the region. This spread of research parks was so widespread that it became expected, almost required, to have a research park in every location that had a research university or laboratory. But just having a research park is not sufficient to have it have an impact. It requires more to make it an asset in terms of regional economic development. So very few of these additional research parks that spread across the country were as successful as these couple of early efforts. What are some of the success factors that we can point to that made a research park work better than most of its competitors? One, it has to match with the core research competencies so that firms are able to benefit from being near particular types of research. In a lot of cases, this means that newer research parks have been more specialized in terms of the technology. For instance, if they're near a research lab in a life sciences field, then they'll be dedicated to life science space, wet labs, and providing supports for life science businesses. If a university is particularly good in one area of research, then the research park may be focused on that as well. A second factor is having access to the research assets. It's not enough just to be next to the research, but what kind of advantages can businesses get from being next to it? For instance, a lot of research parks provide priority access to the businesses that they house. So they will have networking events and meet and greet sessions with faculty in engineering and other research schools. Just being nearby means that you could have arrangements where students work in the business as a co-op or as a, immediate post-graduation. You can have faculty that can take a leave of absence or work part-time for a business or start their own business in the research park. So these sort of provide more access between the research provider and the businesses in the research park. There's also ideas of sharing or giving access to facilities and equipment and technology that is part of what the university can afford, but a new or small business couldn't afford on their own. And students, I want to emphasize that students are a really especially important resource here in research parks. Not only are they a cheap source of labor compared to people who are no longer students, but it's also a mechanism for that technology transfer. Students have cutting edge knowledge. They're working with their professors. They're taking classes. They're working on research in the university. And especially if we're talking about people who are near to graduation, they can bring that knowledge out into a business and transfer that know-how in the form of human capital. This also benefits students, right? Here's ready sources of experience and job opportunities upon graduation. Successful research parks often provide these entrepreneurial supports to businesses that I mentioned earlier, like having a venture capital fund or being flexible in the kinds of space they offer. And that space changes over the firm's life cycle, right? If you're a startup firm, you need only a little bit of space, but you may need to grow rapidly when the time comes. And therefore, is there flexible space? Can you expand within the same location? A lot of research parks also make sure to provide room for some larger firms. Larger and more stable firms go a long way toward making a research park a successful real estate venture, right? Having a stable paying client that isn't going to run into trouble or financial difficulties. That helps you as a research park landlord. So these are some of the success factors in research parks. However, they are no longer in vogue. I would say research parks are not an up-and-coming strategy. Most places that can realistically support a research park already have one. Right, so there's not a lot of room left to create new ones. It's more of a maintenance continuation strategy. Also, only a few of them have done really well. Most research parks are there so that if there is some high potential business or a faculty member who wants to start a business based on university or research lab activity, then there'll be somewhere to put it, somewhere to keep it local. So it's a way to keep up with the competitors and try to decrease brain drain. In all but a few exceptional cases, which include those two I mentioned earlier, Stanford and Research Triangle Park, those are some of the exceptions. In all but a few cases, research parks are not a really important driver of regional economic development. And then the last bullet on this slide is also saying that there have been changes in the desired locations for research and development, for innovation and entrepreneurship, particularly among the amenities that attract workers. The ability to recruit and retain human capital, talent, that's increasingly the most important, the most variable factor that differentiates locations. And there's been a long-term trend away from park-like settings, bucolic, isolated, relaxed locations. Earlier research parks were designed and sited to look like parks. This is a picture of the Research Triangle Park as it looked about 10 years ago. It is in a woodsy setting. It has large buildings surrounded by parking. It does not look like an urban setting at all, and it wasn't designed to look like an urban setting. And research parks advertise themselves that way. Here's a lovely picture of the mist over the woods in the Stanford Research Park, right? It doesn't look like a urban setting here in Chicago or what else. But urban locations are really now perceived as more desirable. They're better for generating agglomeration economies when you put people closer together. And young and well-trained workers tend to prefer urban settings, at least early in their careers. And that's actually been the perception in other parts of the world for much longer than in the US. In Europe, in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, for decades. They don't call their parks research parks. They've been calling them science parks, sometimes technology parks. But they're mostly in urban locations. This is in Seoul, South Korea, the LG Science Park. I don't know what LG stands for. It has some aspects of a park. I can see a little park like sort of raised over a walkway there, but it's pretty urban in its setting, buildings close together. It doesn't have the same feel of a park-like setting. Here's Hong Kong Science Park in China. The view at the bottom shows you how tightly clustered things are. The view at the top shows you it's not, I mean, there's some open space, but it's really focused on where people are working. Here's one from Gothenburg, Sweden, the Lindholmen Science Park. And if you look around Europe and Asia, they much more look like this than they look like the research parks I've been talking about. Some research parks in the US have been trying to retrofit to increase their density, to add amenities. For example, Research Triangle Park in North Carolina changed its charter about 10 years ago to support mixed-use development. Actually, originally, it was prohibited to have residences within the park and all but a very few small convenience stores. They changed that to try to make more mixed use, to try to have more activity. And these renderings of what it might look like in the future include public transit, there's a train down there, include bicycling, include residential and some commercial options. It's also focused much more on a human scale rather than these large buildings separated and isolated from each other. That gives more opportunities for interaction. But it's really hard to change into an urban setting when you are originally a park. And no matter what Research Triangle Park does, it's still not in one of the major cities. It's still in this area about 15 miles south of Durham and about 15 miles west of Raleigh and about 10 miles east of Chapel Hill. It's not really in any of those places. And so it's hard to overcome that in an existing research park. That brings me to innovation districts. I've been researching innovation districts along with two of my colleagues for a bunch of years. My two colleagues, I want to give them their names, and some of the picture credits are to them. So Carla Maria Kayanen, who's now at Maynooth University in Dublin, Ireland. At the time we started working together, she was a doctoral student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And my other colleague, Henry Rensky, who's in the planning department at the University of Massachusetts. And we've worked on studying how innovation districts represent a break from the past, but also a continuation. And I think that starting with research parks allows me to give you the contrast between those two, because innovation districts have quite a few similarities to research parks. Like research parks, they are a spatially defined strategy. There's a region and there's a boundary drawn around it, and that's called the research park, and it's branded and marketed as such. Their intention is to generate and promote innovation and entrepreneurship through benefits from proximity and agglomeration. So again, similar to research parks. And they do offer a variety of programmatic supports for innovation and entrepreneurship activities. But the last bullet I have here under components is really how they're different. How are they unlike research parks is that they are very intentionally urban. They're branded and marketed as providing an urban lifestyle, a continuous activity and access 24/7. Things are going on. Modern, accessible transportation, full of communications infrastructure, mass transit, support for alternative forms of transit like bicycling and pedestrian access. They provide a live, work, play environment. That's sort of again, a phrase that's used to emphasize that you can do all sorts of things within this district, not just work, but there's retail, there's cultural aspects, there's housing, and that can combine multiple lifestyle elements together so that you can flip from one thing to another. That sort of accords with our 24/7 work culture in the United States too. You're going to work for a few hours and then go out and catch a show and then meet your date for dinner and then go back to work, right? And you can do all that in one location. Innovation districts sometimes combine private sector business entrepreneurship with more publicly oriented accessible innovation supports like maker spaces, arts venues, nonprofit organizations around innovation and arts and creation. And they, like research parks, innovation districts may be affiliated with a research institution or a lab, but it's not really required. There are a lot of innovation districts out there that are not anchored by a large research institution. So the proximity advantages they bring are as much or more due to agglomeration of small businesses and entrepreneurs and activity than they are from one major research institution. Although there are certainly some innovation districts that do have research anchors, and I'll talk about examples that have that. What we found in studying innovation districts is that none of these components are really new by themselves. None of these features that define innovation districts is novel in economic development. What is new is combining them together, applying them all in a localized scale within an urban area. Okay? And so it was the combination of their features that made this into a new type of economic development strategy. Really, that has begun in the United States in about 2010. Boston was the first US city to establish what we would think of now as an innovation district in the Seaport District in 2010, importing the idea from the first one that occurred in the world, which was in Barcelona about 8 or 10 years earlier. The strategy, though, has spread really widely in the decade, or what has it been, about 12 years since 2010. This map is totally of my own creation. It is not complete, but it is all the places that I've sort of tracked and paid attention to and read about over the years I've been working on innovation districts. I will also say I last updated this about 16 months ago. So there may be a few new ones here and there, but the pace of creating new innovation districts has definitely slowed down with the pandemic. So I haven't seen as many new ones coming up. There's some question as to whether the pandemic has changed our strategy. I'm of the opinion that it's paused innovation district strategy and that they're starting to come back the way they were before, and sometimes also as a way to recover from the pandemic. So not all the places in the United States that call themselves innovation districts are on this map. Partly, like I said, I haven't found every place, but also I'm only including the ones that, according to my judgment, fit those 4 characteristics, those 4 components that are listed on this slide. There are a lot of places around the United States that call themselves innovation districts, but they're basically just a marketing tool. And in that case, they don't have the characteristics I'm talking about here. I also divide into 2 categories. Some innovation districts build from an existing spatial cluster of innovation. This is the ones in yellow or orangey yellow on the map. Places like Atlanta and Pittsburgh and Houston and Chicago, where our own innovation district is in the Fulton Market area, just north of UIC and the West Loop. It's roughly centered on the Green Line station at Morgan. And it's building on an existing conglomeration, including a Google call center. Is that what it is? A Google center there. And it stretches all the way east in some maps to the merchandise mart, where there's a lot of innovation and technology going on. And that is Chicago's attempt to brand itself as having an innovation district. However, other innovation districts are really de novo. They're attempts to create innovation where it did not occur before, where it was not a factor before. And so often those are redeveloping an underutilized urban location. And that's the kind of innovation districts that I have focused on in my research. And those are the ones that are in green on this map. Our research, I should mention, was funded by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. Probably should have put that on one of these slides, but at least I'll say it orally. And if you're interested, oh yeah, and I do have it here. If you're interested in all the details of these 4 case studies we looked at, the report is available publicly. And there's links to it here on the slide, which I assume this will get posted. Either the slideshow or the video will get posted shortly. So we examined 4 different innovation districts across the country: San Diego, St. Louis, Detroit, and Boston. And we selected these 4 in order to provide contrast among several important dimensions. One of them was the strength of the innovation economy. The 2 coastal cities, Boston and San Diego, they were already strong in innovation and entrepreneurship before looking at this strategy. They're also coastal cities with growing populations, expensive real estate markets. And in contrast, St. Louis and Detroit are legacy manufacturing cities with declining corporate centers. And those 2 cities were looking to innovation districts in order to jumpstart the transition to new economic strengths. And both St. Louis and Detroit have much more modest and affordable living and land costs. We also chose these to vary other structures and features of the innovation district. For instance, how they were proposed and who ran them. In Boston, the innovation district was proposed and developed by the city government, specifically the mayor, who was then Mayor Thomas Menino, and his administration. And they sought to redevelop an area of Boston known as Fort Pierce, I think. That's the wrong name, Fort something or other, but then it changed the name to Seaport. And that was an area of dilapidated warehouses and surface parking. You can see from the picture above, surface parking. This area is located strategically between downtown Boston and Logan Airport. And on the bottom picture, you can see some of the construction scars from the Big Dig. And the Big Dig would put the Interstate 95 underground is what connected and made this area central in the region. Detroit's innovation district in contrast, did not involve the city government at all. In fact, the city government was in receivership at that time, had no money or power, and the state had taken over most of what the city had done. Instead, Detroit's Innovation District was spearheaded by a coalition of local philanthropies, large private sector institutions, and some nonprofit organizations. The boundaries shifted a lot over time, but the ones shown here are typical, and all iterations occupied a huge swath of land. You can see that on the photo from the bottom. It went all the way from the riverfront north to the University District and up through Midtown. This is much, much larger than most innovation districts. And one of the reasons it was made so large is to capture as many of the assets of the city that are involved in innovation as possible, to say that's all part of the innovation district. In San Diego, there are two private real estate developers who got together and devised and promoted the Innovation District. It's entirely a private sector operation, located in the East Village part of downtown. The intention was in part to invigorate the city's downtown, to make a hotspot for innovation, as opposed to, if you know San Diego, most of the innovation in that area is in the North County in Torrey Pines, which is near University of California campus. And that was already well established as the center of biotech innovation in particular. But there is a lot of other types of innovation in San Diego, particularly computing and software, and the intention was to draw on that. And then the last one we studied is the Cortex, the Innovation District in St. Louis, which was created by 5 research institutions, some public and some private. 2 major private research universities adjoin the campus of the Innovation District, Washington University and St. Louis University. In St. Louis, this Innovation District strategy came on top of a considerable history of economic development efforts in that region that are aimed at science and technology as a way to move on from their manufacturing legacy. In this case, the Innovation District's main focus is on biomedical and life sciences. Here are the research methods we used. We mainly did a lot of interviews. These were during site visits where we also walked around and looked at the layouts. We did most of them in person. Some interviews are by phone or through Zoom. And I list all the different types of people and organizations we interviewed in these areas. I think in total, we did something like 120 interviews across the four cases. We also read through a lot of published materials, both from the innovation districts themselves and what was written about them, what has been written about them in local media. And if they had formal plans, we looked at those as well. Now, one caveat here, because innovation districts are relatively new, we did not evaluate their outcomes directly. Strategies like innovation districts, also like research parks, they take a long time to mature, probably multiple decades. And we really have to wait until we can reasonably judge their success. So instead, what we did is we investigated how well their design and implementation matched what they stated as their goals, and how well the strategies fit with the broad goals of economic development across the region. We also looked at what problems they'd encountered so far and responses to those obstacles. And we looked at the trajectory of impact so far. What has happened so far to the local community and across the wider region? Do I have enough time to show that 3-minute video, do you think?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we made a nice little Vimeo video, and I'll see if I can share that with you, and then just talk a little bit about the findings that we had after that. Let's see, do I have it up?
Not yet.
Not up yet. Let me share. Okay, not happening yet. Share screen. There it is. Now are you seeing the web page?
Yep.
Great. And now I just have to start it.
In economic and urban development, innovation districts have become a hot topic. Typically located in cities, these alluring live and work playgrounds concentrate actors, amenities, and resources to provide an environment conducive to innovation. Inspired by seeming successes in Boston and Barcelona, economic developers and policymakers promote innovation districts as a mechanism for generating entrepreneurship, job growth, and urban redevelopment. But are innovation districts an effective way to produce innovative and dynamic economies? Are they really able to achieve the vision of sustainable urban revitalization that its proponents are touting? Or are they just a fad? To answer these questions, we talked with the creators of 4 innovation districts and the entrepreneurs embedded within them. Because these 4 innovation districts are spread across the United States, they present different backgrounds and trajectories. These contrasts enabled us to hone in on some of the key factors that determine an innovation district's outcomes. We found that while innovation districts have important advantages, they are not suitable for all places. In fact, they may be a waste of resources or even displace existing residents. In order to make innovation districts work, it is crucial to know that one size does not fit all. An innovation district's policies and strategies and physical extent should suit the needs and characteristics of the region in which they are rooted. Leadership is crucial. Successful innovation districts are based upon a coherent vision, have active champions, and are supported by the key players in the regional economy. Context matters. Innovation districts cannot develop independently of the economic strengths of their region. Active support from anchor institutions is important, but may not be necessary in places with an already established entrepreneurial ecosystem. Find the right site. An innovation district should be located where it makes sound economic sense, not just where politicians or other elites favor real estate development. Innovation districts aimed at stimulating growth where it is already strong could lead to negative consequences, such as surging costs and dislocated entrepreneurs. Former industrial zones are often a good choice because they offer readily convertible spaces capable of hosting suitable densities in areas convenient to urban amenities. Diversity is necessary. Innovation districts thrive by offering space for businesses of different sizes and residents from various walks of life. If not protected, a successful innovation district can displace the businesses and people that once made it a vibrant environment for innovation. For more information, visit our report with detailed analyses and findings.
So I try to show that whenever I can because we had a lot of fun making that. The voice talent was actually my co-author on the report, Carla Kayanen. So we used her for that. Uh-oh. Hold on a second. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know actually if you could hear that or not. But
We could.
Oh, okay, good. Then you know what I was complaining about. So as you heard there, here are some of the major themes that came out of our study. Cohesive and effective leadership is key. That's pretty much a cliche in economic development practice and probably in all sorts of other areas of life and public policy as well. But it's nevertheless true in the case of innovation districts. It's essential to being able to bring different interests together, keep them together, focused on one goal. So for example, in St. Louis, the regional elite actors, and particularly the leaders of the 5 anchoring research institutions, worked together to develop and champion the initial vision. And they built upon a lot of the earlier efforts at technology-based economic development in St. Louis that, although they weren't very successful, they did over decades bring together regional leaders and policymakers into an agreement that entrepreneurship and technology was a good way to try to revive the regional economy. As a contrast, Detroit was missing this factor of effective leadership. There were lots of organizations involved, but none of them really had a clear lead. Lots of conflict ensued between those who wanted to emphasize community development to bring opportunities to neighborhoods and residents that desperately needed those opportunities versus what was best in order to create innovation and who wanted to, those people wanted to concentrate the efforts more narrowly, have a smaller area and not extend to so many needy neighborhoods. And ultimately that conflict between those two goals led to the end of the innovation district. We don't think of it as an innovation district anymore, and Detroit does not call itself that set of philanthropies and organizations does not call what they're doing an innovation district anymore. It's called, somewhat of a more broad-based community development strategy that focuses less on innovation and more on community job opportunities. A second major theme was sufficient and secure financial resources. Again, hardly a surprise. You need these resources both early and continuing through design and implementation and growth stages. Again, St. Louis is a good example of success there. The 5 founding research institutions contributed an initial an initial $29 million. The state of Missouri contributed $12 million through tax credits for land purchase and assembly. And the city of St. Louis, it was not in good financial shape, not quite as bad as Detroit, but they didn't have money to spare. So what they did instead was something quite unusual. They gave Cortex, the innovation district, the authority to operate a tax increment financing district in lieu of the city government operating it. So in other words, Cortex could issue bonds and borrow money using the future growth that was expected in the innovation district as collateral, a form of debt financing, and it was backed, the guarantee was backed by the city government. So we hadn't seen too many of those sort of financing options for innovation districts in other areas. Boston, I'm showing here Boston's District Hall, that's in the Seaport. They spent $8 million to construct a meeting and workspace center. That's the intellectual center of the innovation district. So, they spent substantial funds there. A third theme is that the character of the local regional real estate market matters a lot. Remember, like research parks, innovation districts are a real estate venture. And Boston and San Diego, with their strong, tight real estate markets, the innovation districts in those areas had to compete with other development opportunities. And that made it hard to keep to the innovation district plans in terms of the pace of development and what sort of businesses they wanted to encourage in and around the innovation district. Boston actually succeeded too well in some ways. They developed the image and cachet of that Seaport district so much that large corporations wanted to move there. Major legal firms who had been in downtown Boston and General Electric, they relocated a campus to the Seaport area of Boston. That raised the costs for the space there and drove out the entrepreneurs. So much so that Boston now has pretty much stopped using Seaport and as a site for innovation. It's just too expensive. And in fact, in an ironic twist, some of those entrepreneurs moved into the now empty legal office buildings and stuff in the downtown, which were now cheaper than the Seaport district. So Boston, the mayoral administration was satisfied because the area had redeveloped, but it was not going to be in an innovation mode, in more of a standard development. San Diego's innovation districts have struggled to gain a footing because in that city, they're working against heavy demand for housing in the downtown. So some of the early efforts to promote the innovation district, the two private developers were doing, it actually lured the attention of luxury condo developers. And we ended up with buildings like this in and right next to the innovation district, which is not conducive to, an innovation district, luxury condos. And without any public support, the private developers are reliant on their own funding and the ability to make the market, equations work. And so they have to accept a lot of compromise. And they're ending up providing more of a mix of sort of high-end residential and retail within the innovation district in addition to business space, instead of focusing just on flexible commercial and industrial space. So the advantage in a place like St. Louis or Detroit with relatively weak real estate markets is that the innovation district was able to exert a lot more control over what was going on in the location, as well as requiring less upfront expenditure because the land is a lot cheaper. The downside, of course, that there's fewer market-driven opportunities in the surrounding areas to build momentum upon. And then the last one I have here is about building local community. Each of the four cases had different strategies for community engagement. So it's hard to summarize across the cases. We actually published a standalone article. It's in Economic Development Quarterly that evaluates this topic. But what we found is that all four innovation districts involved rhetoric to redevelop or create a community within the district and have positive linkages with surrounding neighborhoods. But we found that none of the four really have accomplished this well at all. At best, it's been a secondary consideration in innovation district development, and developing a live, work, play sort of district with amenities that are designed to lure entrepreneurs and innovation workers. That doesn't really necessarily mesh very well with existing residential communities. There's a lack of effective strategies to ensure that the benefits of an innovation district, the new jobs and entrepreneurship opportunities, that they really help existing residents. Most often what local residents are doing is the lower earning, lower security service type jobs, cleaning the buildings and operating the gyms and the shops and the coffee houses and providing security. This is an ever-present concern in economic development, that success leads to displacement. So if these innovation districts are successful and they attract footloose workers and high-end workers and professional class, that'll raise property values and can price existing residents and service workers out of that neighborhood. There's a lot more detail within the report we published for the Kauffman Foundation and within the other published works. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I appreciate very much you listening. Here's some contact information, and happy to answer questions or initiate some or engage in some discussion.
Thank you, Professor Drucker, for a critical look at both the research parks and innovation districts. There's already a question in the chat, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But I'm going to extend my invitation to the audience, especially if you have to leave early, to ask questions or give your remarks. Professor Terry, you have a question?
Hello, thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
I guess in this area, we used to do things called enterprise zones.
Still do.
I still do. And I've never been sure that they've actually been effective. How do these mix into what you've talked about today?
So enterprise zones, there's both state and federal level, right? Enterprise zones is the name for state of Illinois ones, but they overlap, right? There's no reason you can't have both together. And that, I think a lot of what enterprise zones do is provide tax breaks for businesses.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to encourage investment. So to the extent that that works for the current industry, they could. However, enterprise zones are pretty much supposed to be in blighted areas, right? Areas that are not doing well. So I'm not sure that if an innovation district really gets going, it would still qualify for that. And then the way Chicago, the city of Chicago at least, has been thinking about innovation districts is very much let's build upon an existing cluster of innovation already, so it really doesn't overlap too much in practice here in Chicago. It could, though, right? You could definitely see a tool where an enterprise zone is overlaid, or an innovation district is started within an enterprise zone, giving it that extra boost. But I haven't seen that in other places.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, good question.
I'm curious as to, I might have missed it completely, but Chicago is not in one of your slides, as far as I could remember. But I saw in your map that there's a couple, one research park and one innovation district, in the proximity of Chicago, if not in the city. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Oh yeah, the Fulton Market one is the one I identified. So I'm not even sure that it meets our criteria anymore. But when the Fulton Market Innovation District started, it would have met that most of our criteria for defining innovation districts. And that's where I'm referring to the city of Chicago trying to market that region that sort of stretches from the Fulton Market, which is just north of UIC, all the way east to Merchandise Mart along the North River route, as a conglomeration of innovation activity. But what's really missing there is there's not a lot of city supports for entrepreneurship. It's more marketing and campaign and branding, which is done in a lot more places across the country than I identified on that map. We were trying to find places where there's active programmatic support for innovation and entrepreneurs. This whole thing about innovation districts for me grew out of a class project way back when I was teaching a class in planning for innovation. Wow. And World Business Chicago, they were our client for that class, and they wanted to know what should we know about innovation districts so that we can do it in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Guess what we told them of my class, with me directing, but they did the hard lifting, is they found that the best site in Chicago they thought would be in your area, around IIT in Bronzeville. But the city of Chicago wasn't interested in that. They didn't want to start, anew in a place that has a lot of assets, but they're maybe underutilized. They wanted to, have an innovation district tomorrow. So I'm being a little critical of their approach.
No, that was perfect segue to what I'm going to say next, because you already mentioned about the failures in building local communities. I'm just wondering if you can actually use innovation district to promote an inclusive economic development. You already pointed out, most, if not all of the activities, occur around your part of town. Not so much, around my campus here in South Chicago, as I always pointed out in my urban planning class. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that, about using it as an instrument, to promote inclusiveness, if we actually build innovation district, in this south side of Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, when my students wrote that report, I hadn't done all this research on innovation districts. I'm a little bit more skeptical, maybe quite a bit more skeptical about innovation districts as an inclusive strategy than I used to be. Partly because I don't see any successes, particular successes, certainly not among our 4 cases that we studied in depth. I don't see, I mean, it's a classic problem in economic development that you have multiple goals. One of them is going to have to take priority over the others. So in this case, I think my underlying interpretation is that innovation districts, their primary goal is to create innovation. And if that conflicts in the short run, especially with community development, with engaging local residents, then that is a secondary goal. They're going to focus on innovation and getting that up and running. So we see this in our cases in St. Louis to some extent, but we also see it in San Diego. They were pushing out of local neighborhoods. Prices were getting higher, and they had a lot of rhetoric about inclusive innovation and saying, hey, there's a maker space so we can have local artists come in, and we are going to engage local communities. We're going to have a focus group in the neighborhood, but that doesn't prevent the sort of negative implications of economic success. All right, that if you're really trying to attract these high-end, high-educated workers who want to sort of a live, work, play environment, that's not going to be a classic neighborhood that needs assistance. So I'm not sure. I think you run that risk. I think that I have yet to see the right example of putting these two things together. It's possible. I just haven't seen it.
Looks like Professor Shapiro might have a question.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. It was great. I mean, you talked about a measurement of success as being innovation. I wanted you to explain that a little bit more. What exactly you do to measure innovation? And I guess that leads into a broader question, which is, how do you measure these other goals that you said there are these multiple goals. How would you measure these other ones as well?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's at the crux of a lot of this is that, so I'm going to take one easy way out, which this is to say, we didn't want to evaluate innovation districts because we think they're immature, right? So that we're not putting the final word on the ones we looked at. We're saying, how well are you doing so far? And we're trying to measure them against their own goals. But even then, they don't define what they mean by innovation. They don't define their own goals very well. And we did definitely come across that as an issue. One of the things we had in our interview protocols and in talking with innovation district managers and designers in particular is, what do you mean by innovation? And how are you going to know it, what it is? What do you want in your innovation district? They didn't really have answers. They were like, well, whatever is innovation is good, broad as possible, whatever we can get. Now, that wasn't always the case, but I think St. Louis was the counterexample because they had a university medical faculty saying, we want biomedical sciences, and these are the kind of, we want to provide a home for our spin-offs from our faculty. And they had a little bit more of an idea than most of the others. So I think one of the problems is they don't really define innovation, right? They say new businesses, job creation, new ideas. Those aren't innovation, but they conflate those together with sort of standard economic development outcomes. And then how do you balance that with other goals if you're not defining either goal very specifically? Yeah, you can't really do it. That's why I'm somewhat skeptical about whether their rhetoric in those cases really matches their intention. I mean, I think they have good intentions in a sort of loose sense. I just don't think they've really operationalized them carefully. And then we as reviewers of this, that's sort of the easy way out for us, because we could go back and say, here's a definition of innovation. Here's a definition of community development. Do they meet those? And we didn't so much do that because we had enough to criticize already before doing that. So I think that's maybe partially answers your question.
No, that makes sense. It sounds like, something like a composite measure where you have all of these different factors and you somehow integrate them into something. I think that was a great response, though. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll say when we talk to the people who run innovation districts, they're really real estate developers. So if they want quantitative metrics, they're looking at number of jobs created, number of new businesses, how much leased space is vacant versus occupied. Can they build a new building? What are the prices like? If the prices are rising, that's a sign of success. How many new workers do they have on the site? Yes, those are very much the kind of things they're looking at, none of which are tied directly to innovation, but they do increase as innovation increases, they think. We think.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I appreciate also answering my lucky gold star thing. That's good to know. I didn't know that. About the
Yeah.
solar part.
How?
Yeah.
Looks like.
Yeah, thank you for your great talk. So, I just wondering, like for your 4 cases, so seems that they have a different, for the local context. Some is like a private sector more, and some is public sector led more. So I'm wondering how these differences of different types of sector role will affect the success of innovation districts.
Yeah, and that's one reason we wanted to pick cases that had the difference in it. So I don't know if it's always going to be the case because we looked at these 4 examples, but without public support, the only one that had no public support was San Diego, and they really struggled. And they're still struggling. It's still there. It's still an innovation district, but they've had to compromise a lot in order to bend with the market forces, right? So they're having to do more retail and high-end luxury apartments and condos like those buildings I showed, just in order to make enough money and to sell out their projects to get financing so that they can build the kind of space for innovative businesses that they want. So they've had to curtail a lot of their expectations. And that if they had public support, maybe through money, but also could have been through zoning or through other sort of controls on land use and speculation, that's what we did see in St. Louis, to some extent, a little bit of that in Boston, but then they sort of abandoned it. And in that case, it wasn't because the city wasn't interested, it's because the city sort of changed its mind about what it was looking for. Our post-mortem on the Boston Seaport Innovation District was that they wanted development. They saw Innovation District as a way to get development. It was successful in terms of development, and they didn't care if it stayed an Innovation District. So they're happy to let it become something else. That could also be seen as maybe a public sector failure to support innovation. But Boston has plenty of innovation areas in it, right? It's hard to argue that Boston has no other place where innovation occurs. So they just didn't feel the same need that a place like Detroit or St. Louis needs to really provide a spot for innovation to land in their metro area. Detroit had very little city involvement, but it had sort of quasi-public, had foundations, it had the state was involved a little bit, and maybe it wasn't the most generalizable case because that's where the city was not operating as a city during the type of its development. The city was hamstrung with no finances and was being run by the state in terms of its finances. So in that case, so we really did have a contrast among all different sorts, but we found different problems from each one, really.
Mm-hmm. I see. So can even that can be understanders like even the local context matter, but the public support is essential for this innovation district success.
See, again, we hesitate to say essential. It certainly helps.
Okay.
In our 4 cases, we did not find, we found one success, 1 struggling, and 2 that are no longer innovation districts. So we might have ended up choosing ones that mostly failed, right? So I'm hesitant to say that it's not possible to have a success without public sector. I mean, I know there's different types of innovation districts out there. I hear good things about Chattanooga. There's one in California, Riverside, that's just starting. That's not affiliated with the university, but nearby. There's all different sorts of models. So, but at least where we were looking in our cases, the lack of public sector support was influential. So
Okay.
there's me being that, cautious researcher there.
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question, Josh?
Oh, I'm fine. It's up
Okay.
to you guys.
If you have questions, I'm speaking to the audience or comment, you can do it in 2 ways. You can type your question on the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak directly on the microphone.
I think there are some questions there.
Yeah, I think Umberto left already, and he said that his question was already answered.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Oh, okay.
So maybe I'm going to ask my question, and building on what Matt Shapiro said about measure of outcome. Yeah, I was in Korea, for a few years, 2016 2006 to 2010. And there's a lot of conversation about clusters, research clusters. The name Michael Porter, frequently entered the conversation, the Harvard Business School professor. But I think overall, the evidence is mixed at best in terms of promoting growth. And that's one measure that I'm interested, because I am much more macro in my research focus. And I know that's not necessarily what you are interested in, but what I'm wondering, what's the evidence in terms of the broader impact on on the regional economy?
I don't know of any solid evidence on that yet, partly because this is taking a long time to mature, partly because, in every place that there is an innovation district, there's a whole host of other regional strategies going on as well. So I think that, in a research design sense, I would really struggle to say, how would I figure out what the macro impact is of an innovation district? You can do those sort of things, like look at what are the outcomes on the spot of the actual innovation district? How many jobs are there? How many businesses? But then you're saying those wouldn't have been in the region otherwise, right? Which we don't really know. In St. Louis, one of the interesting things they're doing there is trying to link the Cortex Innovation District with several other, I wouldn't call them innovation districts, but innovation hotspots in a sort of a region-wide network, and differentiate among them. So if Cortex is about life sciences, but more biomedical, there's one out at Clayton, or actually it's toward Creve Coeur, so further west in the county. And that one is life sciences around bioagriculture. Monsanto is out there, crop design, genetic engineering. And then there is one on pharmaceuticals too, that's up near UMSL, University of Missouri St. Louis, which is about 5 miles north of Cortex. So these are all life sciences, but they're sort of linking together. And I think that they are interested in this question: can we have a broader regional impact? Because in St. Louis, the ultimate goal of these organizations and the universities is to make the region an innovation powerhouse, to sort of try to replace, the place that used to be the headquarters for a lot of Fortune 500 companies and is no longer, and and wants to be able to keep their talent local. I don't know how you'd measure that precisely, but to some extent they sort of have they sort of have a feeling for it, right? Are we doing well? Is there buzz in the area? Are we getting people to stay in the area after they graduate and put their companies here? Are we getting, St. Louisans who are born and raised to move back after moving to California for years and then move their company back? And so they have anecdotal evidence like that, and they feel like it's somewhat successful. But again, I don't know, in a sort of in a rigorous sense, I can't tell you that.
Thank you. Okay, so I think I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Josh. You've been very generous with your time. And I invite everyone here to give Professor Drucker a big round of applause, either by typing applause on the chat or.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was fun.
Thank you.